It's a real pleasure to be here with you all today and for the next 4 days, I guess, learning about adaptive interventions and sequential multiple assignment randomized trials and how those trials and these kind of statistical tools can be used to, help you make an impact in your field and to help you develop sort of sequenced interventions that are able to adapt to individuals' changing needs over time, and hopefully can move us forward in this age of like personalized medicine, and push this idea of providing the right intervention for the right person at the right time. So I want to start with just kind of an overview of what we'll be doing together for the next few days. And hopefully y'all should be seeing PowerPoint. Oops, great. Okay, thanks. So very, very broadly, the goal of this workshop, this course, is to help you understand how you can design and deploy high-quality, sequentially randomized trials that are going to enable you to construct effective adaptive interventions and to address important scientific questions that are kind of getting in the way of addressing those questions. We're going to do this in a handful of chunks. So today, we're going to spend a lot of time working through the basics. So we're going to learn what an adaptive intervention actually is, what it looks like, what is involved in constructing one. We're also going to learn about SMARTs, sequential multiple assignment randomized trials, and how those can enable you to answer some questions that are going to arise when you're attempting to develop an adaptive intervention. We're also going to explore some scientific questions that are going to motivate the use of adaptive interventions and SMARTs, and also some scientific questions that maybe won't motivate the use of adaptive interventions and SMARTs. It's important throughout, just that, I think a through line of what I do in general is making sure that you as researchers have the tools available to you to answer important scientific questions. But I want to be clear that the tool should not be driving the science should be driving the tool. So throughout, I'm going to be very transparent with you that sometimes a SMART or sometimes an adaptive intervention is not the way to go. And that's okay. The innovation section of your grant should be about the science. It should not necessarily be about the statistical tools, right? So that's going to be kind of an emphasis throughout. So that'll be what we're tackling today. Tomorrow is when we're going to start getting into some of the nitty-gritty statistical stuff. So tomorrow we're going to talk about how to analyze data from SMARTs with binary or continuous outcomes that are collected sort of once at the end of the trial. We're going to talk about what we'll come to call main effects analyses. We'll talk about how to compare adaptive interventions that are embedded in a SMART. And we'll talk about how to choose sample size and think about power for making these comparisons in the context of a SMART. Tomorrow is when we're really going to be getting into some of the coding and the like hands-on analytic piece. So if you don't have R in RStudio set up yet, that's totally fine. Just check out the document in the Google Drive. Try to get it set up later today, tonight, tomorrow morning, and let us know in Slack if you're having any issues. Just reach out with questions, and I'll be happy to help you troubleshoot. So that's tomorrow. Day 3, we start adding a little bit more complexity here. So we're going to go beyond sort of the basic kind of standard SMART design things, and we're with Day 3, and we're going to start focusing on different types of outcomes. Specifically, we're going to look at some time to event outcomes or survival outcomes, and we'll look at SMARTs with longitudinal outcomes that are collected over the course of the trial, and how to analyze data and think about design principles in those contexts. So kind of the same structure as tomorrow, but just with different types of outcomes. And then finally, on Friday, we'll talk about design considerations and some analytic strategies similar to what we've been doing before up until then, with cluster randomized smarts and how those considerations for cluster level interventions and cluster randomized trials might differ from smarts with sort of individual level outcomes or individual level interventions. We'll also talk about some machine learning methods for building a more tailored adaptive intervention using the rich data on sequential trial or sequential treatment that you can get that arises out of a smart. And again, we'll be using R and the kind of going through analytic pieces of this tomorrow, Wednesday. No, tomorrow is Wednesday. Tomorrow, Wednesday. Tomorrow, Thursday, and Friday. There we go. We did it. Okay, so let's dive in and let's learn about what an adaptive intervention is, what it looks like, and some ideas and some principles that go into how they get designed and potentially implemented. So let's start by asking a question: what is an adaptive intervention? It's useful to start out with a definition and make sure that we're all on the same page here. And when I say an adaptive intervention, what I'm referring to is a type of intervention design that is able to adapt the type, timing, intensity, dose, etc., some feature of a treatment over time according to an individual's specific and changing needs. So in practice, what this looks like is an adaptive intervention is essentially a sequence of decision rules that guide how to adapt and readapt treatment to an individual. If you think about like clinical practice, for instance, in psychology or really kind of anything, any kind of like interface when you're providing a treatment to somebody, what you're doing is you're talking to a patient, you're talking to somebody, you're learning about their condition or whatever, however, they're presenting to you, and you're making decisions about how to treat them. And then maybe you try something, you say, come back in 2 weeks, maybe it's not working. And if it's not working, you're going to update your decision. You're going to take what you've learned from that person's response over the past few weeks, and you're going to make another decision about how to move forward with that person. The goal here of an adaptive intervention is really to operationalize and to mimic clinical practice as much as possible. So we're taking this idea of how somebody interacts with a patient or just how things work, really, and we're putting some structure on it so that we can package it as an actual decision support tool that we could build into an electronic health record, or that we could roll out to clinics and say, this is how you should adapt to patients who are not responding to the treatment, so on and so forth. So that is the idea that we're trying to build here and trying to formalize. The key thing that I want to make very, very clear is that an adaptive intervention is a type of intervention. It's in the name. It is not an experimental design. It is not a research design. It is a packaged intervention in and of itself. Keep that in mind because things can get a little bit, it's easy to get a little bit confused. So we'll just keep this flagged. I want to flag that if you are doing research on adaptive interventions, or if you are doing a lit search on adaptive interventions, you're going to find a ton of names for these things. They're sort of all over the place, and they come out of a variety of different traditions. So in the statistical literature, you'll often see them called dynamic treatment regimes or dynamic treatment regimens. You might see them called adaptive treatment strategies or treatment algorithms or individualized treatment rules or treatment policies. Treatment policies is sort of a computer science term. I might use these, I might accidentally refer to an adaptive intervention as a dynamic treatment regimen or a DTR. Just keep that in, that's just force of habit. But I am going to do I'm going to try really hard to not call them an AI because that means something else now. So it's really always meant something else, but that's fine. So just a flag there on terminology. So let's start with an example. This is a hypothetical example. This is not a real adaptive intervention, but it is motivated by a sort of real desire to potentially build an adaptive intervention. This is looking at an intervention to improve cardiovascular health in individuals with serious mental illness. So this population of individuals tends to have 2 to 3 times higher mortality than the general population. And it's primarily due to increased risk of cardiovascular disease. Also, when I say serious mental illness, I mean like severe depression, schizophrenia, things along those lines. So over 10 years ago now, some researchers at Hopkins developed a lifestyle intervention called Achieve. And this is a type of intervention that is delivered in psychiatric rehabilitation outpatient programs. So people come to a psych rehab facility for several hours a day. And as part of Achieve, there are various sort of components geared towards helping an individual improve their cardiovascular health. Particularly, there is a group exercise component. So everybody attending the program will kind of do some exercise together. They will talk about weight management sessions, and then they'll, as a group, and then there will be an individual weight management component to this as well. In a randomized trial against sort of no intervention, the Achieve was shown to yield meaningful weight loss over 18 months. And the idea here is that weight loss is sort of a decent kind of mediator for improved risk of cardiovascular disease. So we saw an effect in the Achieve trial, but we also saw fairly meaningful heterogeneity in the amount of weight loss. So after 18 months of attending Achieve programs, 36% of participants lost no weight relative to baseline, but almost 20% of participants lost more than 10% of their baseline weight, which is a very large, it's meaningful weight loss. So there's heterogeneity here. And what this suggests is that we should try to build a version of Achieve that is able to adapt to the participants in order to address individually, like an individual's specific needs to better achieve that long-term outcome. So here is an example adaptive intervention. What we're going to do is we're going to give everybody initially the full package. We're going to give them an intervention, a version of Achieve that is basically standard Achieve. It consists of the group weight management, the group exercise, and the individual weight management sessions. We're going to do this for 6 months. After 6 months, we're going to look back and we're going to see if the participants who have received the Achieve in the first 6 months lost 5 or more pounds. It turns out that if you lose 5 or more pounds in 6 months, that's a pretty good predictor of long-term weight loss and maintenance of that weight loss. And so the people who lose 5 or more pounds, we're going to say have responded to the intervention. And for the responders, the adaptive intervention is going to recommend that we step down. We can pull back the intensity a little bit, and we can remove that individual weight loss or weight management component and just focus on the group sessions. However, for the individuals who did not lose 5 or more pounds over the first 6 months of the intervention, they're going to be classed as a non-responder. And instead of stepping them down, we're going to actually increase the frequency of the individual weight management component. So we're going to have them meet with a coach one-on-one twice a week, say, instead of once a week. So you can see that we're watching, we're trying something, we're looking to see what happened, and then we are adapting treatment sort of appropriately in response to that. There's a question in the chat about how 5+ pounds of weight loss was determined. My understanding is that there is some literature that says 5 pounds in 6 months is sort of a meaningful cutoff here. And we can talk more specifically about how to determine this response, non-response status in just a few minutes. Okay, so here is this, some people like words instead of pictures. I am not one of those people, but we'll try it. So this is that sequence of decision rules in words. So initially, the adaptive intervention says provide all patients with group weight management sessions, group exercise, and individual weight management sessions. After 6 months, assess whether the patient has lost 5 pounds. If yes, we're going to continue with treatment but stop the individual weight management sessions. Otherwise, if no, continue with treatment and increase the frequency of individual weight management sessions to twice weekly, and then we'll continue this for another 12 months. Okay, that's adaptive intervention, or that's an example adaptive intervention. Let's ask why we should think about this. Why are we interested in adaptive interventions? So there are a few reasons for this. One is what motivated that achieve example. It's heterogeneity in response to an intervention. What works for one person or clinic or school or county or some unit might not work for another. There could be meaningful heterogeneity in outcomes after delivering an intervention. So the need for a particular intervention or the response to a particular intervention might vary quite widely across units. An adaptive intervention can identify individuals who might need, for instance, individual support. We can modify the intervention accordingly and then ultimately work to prevent ultimate failure by doing that modification. So that's one reason to think about an adaptive intervention. Question in the chat, in the previous example, was there a negative control group? There is not a control group in the adaptive intervention because an adaptive intervention is not a research design. So it doesn't make sense to talk about a control group when I'm just talking about the treatment itself. Great question, though. Okay, so heterogeneity is one reason to think about adaptive interventions. Another reason is burden. Interventions can be really burdensome when participants are asked to invest time or effort, particularly in situations involving, like, for instance, I work with substance use examples a lot. And so substance use disorder treatment programs tend to be like intensive outpatient programs where you go to a facility for 6 hours a day, every day. That's a lot. Burden can lead to poor adherence. And intervention effects are probably mediated by adherence. I actually kind of can't think of an example where adherence doesn't mediate an intervention effect. I don't know if you can, you can't get the effect of a treatment if you don't do it. So if you have poor adherence, that's going to attenuate your treatment effects. Your treatment effects will become smaller because people just aren't engaging in what you're asking them to do. An adaptive intervention, on the other hand, might be able to identify signs of burden early on and modify the intervention intensity so that we can keep people on treatment for longer. Another reason to think about adaptive interventions is cost. We live in a world with probably finite resources. Certain interventions can be really expensive to deliver, and things that are expensive are really hard to scale. So if we can think about a way to kind of judiciously or strategically use intervention components that are very expensive in order to maximize outcomes while minimizing costs on average, that could be really powerful. We could, for instance, save more expensive interventions for the people who need them the most, or we could, sometimes it's most cost effective to just rip the Band-Aid, give everybody the really expensive thing for a short period of time, and then that minimizes need for long-term maintenance, for instance. But adaptive interventions are able to potentially modify treatment or, think about ways of modifying treatment that can minimize cost over time. So that's another reason to think about adaptive interventions. Before we get into more specifics, I want to pause for questions, see what questions y'all have about motivation or kind of big picture what these things are.
I have a question about the idea of, kind of starting small and building the intervention versus starting big and tapering.
Yeah.
Is there any research to suggest one is more effective than the other, or is it population dependent?
I'm sure it's intervention, population,
Yeah.
question specific. I think I have seen both. Where, if you, I'm thinking like part of what the Affordable Care Act did, for instance, was to like, get more people into prevention approaches. That is obviously like there's an upfront cost to that, right? To go get annual cancer screens or something like that, right? And if you're not doing that, you're not paying that cost. But it minimizes the long-term
Sure.
need for more expensive things. At the same time, maybe we don't, if somebody is like really treatment resistant or something like that, then maybe it makes sense to start upping intensity later on and say, all right, well, now we got to bring out the big guns, the expensive stuff. So I've seen both ways, right? And it's kind of depend on the context. It's also interesting because we'll see that is a question that you could ask
Sure.
when developing these.
Thank you.
Of course. Thanks for the question. Question in the chat from Drew. Do you have a favorite example in existing literature of what you consider a gold standard SMART or adaptive intervention? I have some. The goal is to provide kind of a list for you of good SMARTs. There's one that's really interesting. The PI is Bill Pelham. He's at one of the UCs. Looking at building an adaptive intervention to help treat ADHD in kids in like a school-based setting. Yeah, it's a great trial. All right, Florida, yes, okay, thanks. All right, other questions?
Yes, hi. I
Hey.
have a question. Sorry. Sorry for my English. I speak Spanish. But I've been asked many times about what is the main difference between action research. I'm not very sure if it's the translation in English. Do you know it? Do you know it?
Say it again, sorry.
Action research, or we call it in Spanish, investigación, acción.
I'm actually not familiar with the term.
Yeah, I've read many research about it, but I think it's more like a qualitative research, which is when you are doing and at the same time are assessing what you are doing. And in education field, it's very well used, and I think in psychology as well. You can correct me.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah, well, maybe I can write that in the Slack.
Yeah, that would be great. Because this
I can give you an
interesting.
Example.
Based
yes,
on a
because
quick
I've been
Google.
asked like, what is the main difference? And I would really like to know your opinion.
Yeah, based on a quick Wikipedia search, it seems like action research is well, okay, I'll tell you, I'll give you more context about an adaptive intervention. So the idea of an adaptive intervention is that it's a very protocolized thing. So it's a specific set of rules that say this is how you respond in this treatment context or in this like it's in a particular context, right? So if a student comes to you and says, reports severe ADHD symptoms, right? This is how you should respond to this, kind of something along those lines. It's less right now. Again, we're not talking about a research design, so we're not talking about we're talking about something fixed a priori that tells us kind of what to do in particular situations, and we're less sort of we're responding in real time, but we know how we're going to respond in advance. Okay, thanks for the question. All right, so let's talk about adaptive interventions and what goes into them. So there are 5 key components of an adaptive intervention, and we'll walk through each of them. The first component is decision points. These are times at which you're going to make a decision about how to potentially modify treatment. Intervention options are the things, the versions of the intervention that you could potentially combine or modify in certain ways. Tailoring variables that'll decide who's a responder and who's a non-responder. The decision rules themselves, as well as the proximal and distal outcomes that are going to guide the construction of the adaptive intervention throughout. So let's go back to our example adaptive intervention. Here, we have 2 decision points. The decision point, like I said, is a time at which the intervention might be adapted to an individual. And we have 2 here, one at treatment outset, when the decision is give everybody the full intervention package, give everybody full achieve. So we decide how to initiate treatment. It just turns out that the decision here is not much of a decision. We have one thing to do. We have a second decision point at 6 months. And 6 months is when we decide, based on an individual's changing, an individual's sort of weight loss up until that point, that's when we decide how to modify treatment. Do we step down and remove the individual weight management component, or do we step up the frequency of the individual weight management component? So 2 decision points. The choice of when to have a decision point should be guided by things like existing evidence. So when do you have evidence to suggest that we need to modify treatment? In this sort of hypothetical context, we have evidence that says if you haven't lost 5 pounds in 6 months on a weight loss intervention, it's probably not going to work for you long term. And so we need to switch things up. Another way to guide where you're putting your decision points is just the nature of the intervention or the setting you're in. So after a 6-week intervention, like, what do you do next? So if your intervention is designed to last for 6 weeks, that's kind of a natural time to modify it, potentially. If you have a school-based intervention, maybe you modify over the winter break. So you have a natural break in treatment there, and so you can come back in the next semester and try something new, try an adaptation there. The nature of the disease or the outcome that you're interested in affecting can also guide your choice of decision points. So you might want to change treatment as soon as you have signs that are pointing to early failure. So if you're treating kids with ADHD and you notice that they stop responding to your behavioral intervention fairly early on, you probably want to switch things up for them sooner rather than later. And so you can look for this kind of early long-term failure and modify appropriately. So we've got 2 types of decision points that we can think about. So one is called a fixed time decision point, where we're going to adapt treatment at times that we know a priori. So after 6 months, after the first semester, things like that, sort of kind of fixed intervals. This is really useful when the intervention duration is either fixed in advance or known somehow, right? So I talked about a 6-week intervention package. Or if you have an idea of how long the exposure needs to be to understand whether treatment is working or not. That's a great time to think about a fixed time decision point. An alternative is to use what I would call a trigger-based decision point, where your treatment is adapted based on, rather than at specific times that you know a priori, based on rules that you specify a priori. So when the disease that you're trying to treat progresses, or you cross some threshold in some outcome. So when you're measuring individuals over time, and you might find signs of early failure at many of those, at one or many of those time points. So if you're screening kids monthly for ADHD, for instance, you might be able to see, oh, the effective treatment is waning, it's crossed some threshold, now we have to modify treatment. So here you're protocolizing when you're adapting, but you're being a little flexible about when it's happening. So this is really useful when the duration of the exposure that you need to get a particular outcome is unknown or it's flexible. Question in the chat about, is the trigger decision point similar to a just-in-time adaptive intervention? Maybe. This might be a good question for offline. The just-in-time adaptive intervention they're related. They get studied in slightly different contexts. So maybe we can chat about this on Slack, actually. Questions about decision points and timing. Okay. So let's talk about the second part of an adaptive intervention, which is the intervention options. So these are it's exactly what it sounds like. They're possible ways to treat or intervene at each decision point. So I have 3 intervention options here, actually 3 combinations of intervention options. And these could be things like, type or intensity or dose or delivery method or timing of treatment, for instance. So here, one intervention option is this full combination. Another intervention option is the removal of individual weight management. A third is adding more frequent individual weight management. I could also totally switch things up, right? For the responders, I could say, we're done. Like, you're good. We've given you the tools to deal with this on your own. We can kind of step down even more. Or I can transition them to a maintenance treatment or something like that. So sky's the limit with this. You can be really creative here. So here, just again, note that we have different combinations of the same 3 components. So here the question is, how do we combine these things that we already know kind of work, and how do we stack them together in a particular way? So notice also that I've been referring to the second stage intervention options by sort of tactics here, or by like adaptation strategies. So for the responders, I'm recommending a step down approach, but for the non-responders, I'm recommending a step up. So there's a way to think about an adaptive intervention in the framework of like a stepped care model, where we can kind of adaptively ratchet up or down as necessary to help an individual achieve those long-term outcomes. All right, now this is the meaty part. We want to talk about tailoring. So the tailoring variable is it's a piece of information or pieces of information that get collected on individuals over time that are used to individualize or adapt treatment at each decision point. So in our hypothetical example, we have one tailoring variable, and that tailoring variable is, did the individual lose 5 or more pounds after 6 months? Yes or no? If they did, they're a responder. If they didn't, they're a non-responder. Notice that this tailoring is only happening at one decision point. Our first decision point doesn't have a tailoring variable. It's untailored because we're giving everybody the same thing. So the tailoring is happening at 6 months, and it's based on that 5 or more pound weight loss in 6 months. Tailoring variables are really important here. Tailoring variables are essentially how you decide a priori to adapt your intervention. So we want to give a lot of careful thought into how we're going to introduce a tailoring variable into our adaptive intervention. There are a couple of types of tailoring variables that we could consider here. The first type is a static tailoring variable, and that's going to be information that doesn't change over time, but that can still guide treatment modification. So for instance, a baseline risk score, or baseline age, or sex assigned at birth. This is in contrast to a dynamic tailoring variable that changes over time, possibly in response to treatment, and that we're going to use to guide how we modify treatment. So this is things like response, however we might classify response, or adherence. If we're thinking in that kind of burden context, right? Maybe we need to modify our intervention based on whether or not people are showing up for treatment. We could have some sort of risk score model that's running throughout, and we could update the risk score after we provide that first stage intervention or at different time points throughout. We could use that, some sort of thresholded risk score to guide decisions. We could also use things like ongoing disease severity. So in cancer, for instance, we might see like, oh, the tumor has increased in size or it has not shrunk. And so we're going to use that information. Before we keep going, what questions do you have about kind of the big idea of a tailoring variable? Okay.
Sorry,
Yeah.
I put something in the chat. I was
Oh,
saying,
I'm sorry.
can you give
Yeah.
an example of this static tailoring variable? I just don't seem to see how it can be used for tailoring when it's static.
Yes, it's a great question. It turns out that they are not particularly useful. A piece of static tailoring, or like an example of static tailoring, might be really useful if we wanted to, for instance, adapt at baseline here. So we have no treatment information, or we have no ongoing information, and so we might say that, individuals over 65 should receive this intervention, whereas folks who are under 65 should receive this other version of things. And so we could use that kind of information that, age at baseline is fixed. It's not going to change in response to treatment, and so we could use that to adjust this first intervention. We could kind of use it here in terms of how to modify treatment, but it feels not very interesting or very useful, right? Like if I'm going to use information from baseline halfway through the intervention, why didn't I just do that from the start in some sense, So it's a great question, but I think the answer is it's useful potentially at baseline. Thanks for the question. Okay. Okay. Excellent. Any other questions? Great. Okay, so let's think about the tailoring variable in the context of this adaptive intervention. So the adaptive intervention is this entire diagram. It's the entire sequence of decision rules that I laid out in words a few slides ago. So critically, the tailoring variable is used to make used by the adaptive intervention to make a recommendation for everybody. So everybody has a particular value of the tailoring variable, and for every possible value of the tailoring variable, the adaptive intervention is making a recommendation for what to do next. The tailoring variable is built in to the intervention that we are studying. So notice that we are making a treatment recommendation for both responders and non-responders. This entire diagram is the intervention. Does that feel okay? We're going to keep coming back to this idea that an adaptive intervention, and I'm going to keep saying it exactly like this, an adaptive intervention makes a treatment recommendation for every level of the tailoring variable. All right. So let's talk about how to choose tailoring variables. We kind of have an idea of what they are. Let's talk about how to pick one. How do we think about this? Because a tailoring variable is part of the intervention, it's part of the adaptive intervention, tailoring variables need to be pre-specified and well-defined. They have to be something that is useful in guiding treatment decisions. And what makes it a variable useful in guiding treatment decisions can be based on practical, ethical, or scientific considerations. So as an example, if you have a tailoring variable that is not very well defined, that's kind of squishy, that you're like, I don't know, the clinician decides that this person responded. That's going to really affect what happens long term, because response is not really well defined. What is one person's response could be another person's non-response. So if there aren't those kind of objective, well-defined criteria, you're going to get people potentially assigned to the wrong treatment long term. I mean, that would be suboptimal. So let's talk about these practical, ethical, and scientific considerations. So a practical tailoring variable is one where you're just kind of constrained by what exists and the realities of your field and your intervention in terms of how to modify treatment. So for instance, if one intervention option requires in-person clinic visits and one is telehealth, let's say, then you might tailor on transportation access. So I can't provide the in-person visit to somebody who has no way to get to the clinic reliably. That would be an example of a static tailoring variable. At baseline, do you have reliable access to transportation to come in and visit the clinic for the study, or for the intervention, rather? Or, for instance, going back to cost, if one intervention option is really expensive, you might tailor on whether the individual has not responded to cheaper options. So we're going to try something cheap for the first one. If it works for some people, that's great. We can kind of keep going there. But if not, then we'll try the more expensive option for the people who aren't responding. So those are some practical examples of tailoring variables. Essentially, what you're doing here is you're making decisions about how to modify treatment based on just the realities and what's feasible for the intervention in this particular context. For the individuals, for the patients, or even for the clinicians who are delivering the intervention, right? Just how do we make this work? So that's practical considerations. Ethical considerations are another way to think about a tailoring variable. So based on ethical considerations, we might rule in or out intervention options for different people. So for instance, if a patient has had a severe adverse reaction to a medication, we cannot ethically continue them on that medication. We can't say, just keep going. So we need to modify their treatment such that we remove that treatment that they're having a severe reaction to. In some settings, you may be ethically required to offer a treatment modification if there are signs of long-term treatment failure. So for instance, I work a lot in cancer now at Penn, and so if we see that somebody's tumor is growing on a particular experimental therapy, we have to ethically offer them something else. Like we have to change something. Essentially, what is happening here, the ethical tailoring variable is a way to make treatment decisions according to your professional standards of care when such decisions are required. This can kind of constrain you in particular ways, right? But I think we're all used to the idea, or we should be, that you can't do stuff to people, or you can't always do exactly what you want to people. People have agency. So bringing ethical considerations into your tailoring can be very important and powerful. There are a few other versions or types of tailoring variables that are based on scientific considerations. The first is actually this example of did you lose 5 or more pounds in 6 months? That's a prognostic tailoring variable. So this is going to be something that's going to help identify early signs of failure or the need for intervention modification based on kind of correlation or association with long-term outcomes. So there is evidence in the literature that suggests that individuals who lose less than 5 pounds after 6 months of Achieve are likely to experience worse long-term cardiovascular outcomes than those who lose at least 5 pounds. So here, because of this association, this kind of dichotomous thing of like 5 pounds being a cutoff for like quality of long-term outcome, we want to be able to adapt the intervention so that we can, still get good outcomes among the people who aren't losing weight in 6 months. So that's a prognostic tailoring variable that we found in the literature. There's an association there. So loss of 5 or more pounds in 6 months is a good prognosticator in that sense. Another potential tailoring variable is a moderator. So a moderator tailoring variable is going to help you identify subgroups who would or would not benefit from particular treatment options. So let's say that we have a tailoring variable, and I'm going to plot various values of my tailoring variable on the x-axis here, and I have some long-term outcome where higher is better on the y-axis. And I have two possible treatment outcomes, or treatment options. I have treatment A or treatment B. It turns out that for a value of the tailoring variable that is higher than this cutoff that I've labeled C, treatment A is better. Treatment A is going to lead to long-term better outcomes than treatment B. But if your value of the tailoring variable is less than the cutoff, C, then you should get treatment B, because that's going to lead to a better long-term outcome for you on average. And so this is a moderator that's going to be useful for determining different subgroups of patients or individuals who should get different versions of the treatment. What questions do you have about this idea? And actually, before we get into questions about the moderator, I noticed Mackenzie left something in the chat. So would the prognosticator also help capture treatment mediators? Yeah, potentially. Thinking about a prognostic tailoring variable as something that could potentially mediate a long-term treatment effect, I think would be useful. Yeah. Other questions about either the moderator tailoring variable or the prognostic tailoring variable, or really anything that we've covered so far? Yeah, an example of a moderator. So let's say, for instance, that we also collected information in the Achieve example on individuals, say, like disease burden in some sense. So like how severe is the severe mental illness, and maybe there's some measure of like you know, ability to socialize or something like that. For an individual who maybe has a rather severe like a condition that might really impact their sort of response to groups. So if they don't do well in groups and they kind of need individual behaviors, then maybe they're going to get, maybe we should recommend that we step down the group components of the intervention and step up the individual components. Whereas if somebody shows signs of doing well in groups, then we would step up the group and step down the individual. Is that useful? I'm trying to think of something that might be measured continuously, where we're just going to see that certain intervention components are better or worse for different types of people. DNA methylation data could also, yeah, that could be useful there, right? There might be some sort of genetic component here where if you have a certain amount of gene expression in one aspect, you might respond better to a particular drug than another. Can a tailoring variable be both a prognosticator and a moderator? Sure, yeah. I mean, ideally, moderators are probably associated with the outcome in some sense. And so looking at what is happening in that regard, and those kind of looking at the effects of different treatment effects, looking at the effects of different treatment options or intervention options as a, yeah, essentially, yes. Yeah, hopefully that's was sort of a convoluted way to deal with this. And I apologize, I'm trying to also manage kind of hosting duties here. Great, okay. Okay. One example of a moderating variable from Angela in the chat might be biomarkers at baseline that predict which treatment will work best. Yeah, absolutely. Thinking about this as a biomarker is super useful. Okay. So this is an example of a moderator. And notice that it's a moderator because my lines for treatment A and treatment B have different slopes, right? There is an interaction between treatment and outcome and the tailoring variable here, or treatment and the tailoring variable in my outcome model. But there's a different type of moderator that is not a particularly useful tailoring variable, and that is going to be one that kind of looks something like this. So notice that in this example, the lines don't cross. The slopes are unequal, definitely. There is an interaction here, but this doesn't tell us that people with different values of the candidate tailoring variable should receive different treatment. Treatment B is better for everybody. So this is not a particularly useful tailoring variable here because it doesn't actually suggest that we should tailor. It says we shouldn't tailor based on this tailoring variable. So when you're thinking about potential moderators, you want to make sure that the treatment effects are actually crossing here. And otherwise, you're going to end up with something that's not particularly useful. More questions about moderators. What do you got, gang? Also, I should clarify, this is what I tell my students all the time. Huh is a question. That's a complete sentence that you don't know what's going on. That's okay. Okay. I should also clarify that I once taught senior undergrads at 8:30 in the morning on Fridays. So I'm very good at sitting in silence waiting for questions. If it gets to be too much, let me know. All right. So let's talk a little bit more about tailoring variables and particularly validity and reliability. And so hopefully these are relatively familiar concepts. But the idea is that a tailoring variable is a valid tailoring variable. Really anything is a valid measure if it measures what it says it measures. So if you have an invalid measure that you embed in your adaptive intervention as a tailoring variable, that might lead to systematic poor recommendations of intervention options, right? We have something that we think we're tailoring based on some, psychometric construct. If the construct is invalid and doesn't measure what it says it measures, then we've just kind of assigned people willy-nilly to treatment options. And so we're making bad recommendations or not very useful recommendations, and that's going to be a problem. That's not going to lead to long-term success of our intervention. So we want to think very hard about validity. We also want to think very hard about reliability. So a valid measure that is not very reliable, meaning it can't be measured consistently, is also not a great tailoring variable. So if you have a tailoring variable that is very difficult to measure or difficult to measure consistently, that can lead to systematically assigning the wrong intervention options to people, or assigning intervention options to folks based on just random noise. And again, that's going to really decrease the potential impact of your adaptive intervention because you're doing something that is kind of random. Just like in the sense that if your tailoring variable is clinician judgment, for instance, that's going to vary quite highly from clinician to clinician. And so that is going to impact the potential effect of your adaptive intervention. This is the last slide on tailoring variables. So I will again pause to see what questions you have. Otherwise, we'll keep going. Kim asks, can I interpret that the choice of tailoring variables is part of the intervention? Yes, absolutely. The tailoring variable gets built in to the adaptive intervention. And so because it tells you how you're going to modify the intervention. And so if you pick a tailoring variable that is not so good, that's gonna lead to problems. Okay.
I have a small question.
Yes, absolutely.
Just to be precise with the concepts, do I talk about tailoring variables that are valid or reliable, Or do I talk about the instruments that measure tailoring variables are valid or reliable? Because the issue can be in the instrument and not in the variable.
That's a great question. It's probably the instrument in your case. So we want to tailor based on, say, anxiety after a particular amount of treatment. And if the instruments that we are using to measure anxiety are not valid and reliable, then we're going to have a problem. That doesn't mean that anxiety is not a valid or like not a real construct. But the way that we classify people needs to be valid and reliable. Great question. Thanks for clarifying. All right. So a good tailoring variable is both valid and reliable. Okay, now let's start bringing things together and start thinking about the fourth component of an adaptive intervention, which are the decision rules. So the decision rules are essentially ways to recommend an intervention option for individuals at every decision point, possibly based on a tailoring variable. So we have two decision rules rather in this adaptive intervention. The first, is this first? Sorry, yes, trying to remember animation order. So we have, actually, sorry, this is out of order. Decision rule 1 is give everybody group weight management plus group exercise plus individual weight management. We talked about how this is not this is sort of a degenerate decision rule in that it is untailored. Everybody just gets this. The decision is easy to make. We're just, if you're a person getting the intervention, you're starting with this. The second decision rule is to remove individual weight management for responders and increase frequency of individual weight management for non-responders. So this is the second decision rule that is embedded here. We're looking at if responder, do this, if non-responder, do this other thing. So this adaptive intervention consists of 2 decision rules. And because it consists of 2 decision rules, we say that this is a 2-stage adaptive intervention. In the first stage, we're doing our sort of degenerate decision rule. In the second stage, we're modifying treatment based on this response status. A 3-stage adaptive intervention would then have another decision rule out here after everything that might adapt things even further. Okay, so here is this in words. So decision rules pull everything together and need to be clear, precise, and thorough. So let's talk through a couple of potential framings and wordings for decision rules. So here's that second decision rule that we had in the trial, or in the intervention rather. So if the patient responds, remove individual weight management. If they don't respond, increase the frequency of individual weight management. So this is fine. It kind of tells you what to do, but what does it mean for the individual to respond? What does it mean if they don't respond? When should I be doing this? Like, this is not a, if I were a clinician and you told me to do this, there's a lot of fuzziness here. So we want to try to make this a little bit more precise. Here's another version. If the patient loses at least 5 pounds after 6 months, remove individual weight management and continue with group exercise and group weight management. If they lose less than 5 pounds, increase frequency of individual weight management and continue with group exercise and group weight management. So this is better, right? I have now said what is response. I have said when you should be doing the adaptation. But I can still be more specific here. I can still kind of protocolize this a little bit better. We want to kind of make this, we want to make this something that we can hand to somebody and they can understand, kind of just by reading it. So here's another example, more specific. If the patient loses at least 5 pounds after 6 months, that should not be 6+, I'm sorry, after 6 months, remove individual weight management and continue with group exercise and group weight management as is. So I'm emphasizing that things should be continuing and the only thing that's changing is that step down. If the individual loses less than 5 pounds, increase the frequency of individual weight management to twice weekly. So I'm being more specific about what that intervention step up is, and continue with group exercise and group weight management. For everybody, continue after the adaptation for an additional 12 months. So now I'm being a lot more specific about timing. I'm being very specific and detailed about what the interventions options are, and in addition to being clear about timing and tailoring. So this is how to write a good, solid, sort of bulletproof, in some sense, decision rule.